All right. Hello, my name is Sean Taylor. I am manager of the Stationary Source Compliance Program, and I am going to be talking to you about my program. So, as a brief overview, what my program does, we cover primarily inspections, reporting, enforcement, performance tests, and complaint investigations. So, I'll be talking to you about each of those topics. So first, inspections. Basically, what an inspection is, it's somewhat self-explanatory, but we do on-site review of monitoring records and direct observation of operations. So we're basically checking to make sure everything is operating like it's supposed to, making sure there's no visible emissions to any extent or within their permit limits. So we're checking to verify compliance with all conditions of the facility's permit. So making sure they have all their records, all their monitoring, they're in compliance with all the limits that are in place. And then we have a specified frequency that we're required to do by EPA. So our major sources, so those are the largest sources in the state, we're required to inspect those at least once every 2 years. And then our synthetic minor sources, which are basically medium-sized type sources, we're required to inspect at least once every 5 years. We typically do them a little more frequently than that on both. Some major sources we do every year. Some synthetic minor sources we do maybe 2, 3, 4 years. So very rarely do any of those go to 5 years. And then our district offices, so we have 7 district offices across the state. They conduct about 25% of all the air inspections, and primarily they're inspecting those synthetic minor sources with a few major sources thrown in our Cartersville office due to some senior staffing that they have in that office that others do not. And then the next part that we do in compliance program, we review a lot of reports. So all of our major sources will have at least semi-annual reports. Some of them are quarterly. It just depends on the way the permit's written. Usually the quarterly reports are for the largest sources that are required to have continuous monitoring systems. And then our synthetic minor and true minor sources may also have some reporting requirements, again, just based on how the permit is written. And the permit does specify what exactly is required to be reported, but usually includes deviations from emission limits, parametric monitoring limits, such as like baghouse pressure drops, scrubber, flow rates, basically any kind of parameter that they're required to measure for their control devices and other things. And then they're also required to report any monitor downtime that they may have, whether it's a continuous monitor or maybe just like a daily monitoring that they're required to do once per shift, whatever the permit requires. And then the next part in our program, we review a lot of performance tests. So facilities in the state are required to do performance tests at a frequency specified in their permit. It could be one time, usually within so many days of startup. It could be an annual test, could be every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years. It just depends on the way the permit's written. In some cases, it may require a test based on a federal standard. So basically, they're making sure that they can meet their emission limits through those tests. So it's usually like a 3-hour run or 3 1-hour runs that they're required to do. Some have longer requirements. Some may have even shorter requirements, but typically 3 1-hour runs is kind of the standard. And then the engineers in our source monitoring unit review those tech tests to verify that they use the proper methods. They also go out and witness some of those tests and see for themselves that they're following the right methods and make corrections in real time if necessary. And then making sure the proper procedures were used. And then they also document those results and those operational parameters, as I referred to earlier, like the baghouse pressure drops, scrubber flow rates, things like that in a short report, because those will set the ranges that they'll have to operate in going forward from the date of that test. They may test again a year later and they can reset those parameters. So as long as they pass, they can use whatever parameters are measured during that test. And then the next thing we do in the compliance program, we do enforcement actions. So we have different levels of enforcement, starting at the most basic level, which is a letter of noncompliance. So those are informal violations for less serious things. And then we have a notice of violation, and those are a little more serious. So we consider those a little more formal, and we report notices of violation and anything below that on this list to EPA. Letters of noncompliance are not reported to EPA. And then we have a subset of notices of violation called high priority violations. So those meet specified criteria defined by EPA, generally addressing long-term excess emissions, usually due to like a failed stack test or maybe what I would call, in some cases, like general disregard for the requirements of the permit. We've had a few cases like that where we show up and they're just not familiar with the requirements of their permit. So those usually result in those high priority violations where they're basically not doing anything they're supposed to be doing. Then beyond that, we have consent orders. So that's basically an agreement between the EPD and the company to resolve those violations. There's usually a monetary settlement associated with those. Really, the only ones that don't have monetary settlements are federal entities that were just simply not allowed to impose a settlement. But otherwise, there's almost always usually minimum of $1,000 going on with those. And then we have administrative orders, and that's a directive. So a unilateral agreement, or really not an agreement, but just a unilateral order with the company. Those are very rare. It's usually when the company doesn't sign a consent order. So basically they're not agreeing to the terms and we just can't come to a mutual understanding. Those are the very rare cases where you have an administrative order, maybe not even once a year. So like I said, very, very rare. And then we do complaint investigations. So what we do with that, if we get a complaint, whether it comes in by email or phone call, or if some cases they come in from EPA, we follow up with the complainant and the facility in question to try to figure out what's going on. Most of the complaints we get are usually related to dust or odor complaints, and we don't necessarily regulate odor directly. We may look at that if if it becomes a real nuisance, we may get a little more serious with those odor complaints, but we don't, we try to tie those odors back to an actual pollutant that's regulated, such as, hydrogen sulfide, for example. That's your typical rotten egg odor. So if they're emitting something like that, that's causing these odor complaints, we can enforce those, but odors in and of themselves, kind of subjective. So we don't really do too much with those. Dust definitely is regulated. So we definitely, we'll look into dust complaints and try to minimize those wherever possible. A lot of our complaints are referred to and from the district offices, so they're really the kind of the boots on the ground folks, spread throughout the state, so they can get to a lot of those complaints quicker. And they have more sources assigned to them just in general. So all of our true minor sources, we have thousands of those that we don't inspect on a regular basis, but if we get complaints, those are ones that the district offices can get out to fairly quickly. And then the air branch staff, we only typically handle about 60 complaints per year, whereas someone in the district, that might be a month for a single person in a district office. They're very busy with complaints, and that they handle things beyond just air complaints. So they handle solid waste, hazardous waste, water issues. So they cover all media in the district offices, which is why they have a lot more complaints. And then finally, the compliance program handles our risk management program. So that's a very specific requirement in the Clean Air Act for the chemical accident prevention provisions. And that requires facilities that store above a threshold quantity of any hazardous chemicals to have a plan to ensure that they are stored and handled safely. There's a lot of requirements in that, and in terms of looking at how they store their chemicals, how they inspect those things frequently, do operator training, alert local responders such as fire stations, things like that, making sure they have emergency contact so they can get in touch with people if there is an incident. They look at offsite consequences, things like that, to see how many people it might affect if there is an incident, and again, try to minimize those by taking the proper procedures. We have approximately 260 of those facilities in Georgia. Most of them are dealing with ammonia and chlorine. Ammonia is basically a cheap refrigerant. So rather than like your Freon that you use in your, air conditioning unit at home, ammonia is used on like large quantity basis for like cold storage facilities. So we have a lot of those in the state. We have a lot of chicken plants in the state that they have to store a lot of those things for longer periods. So they use ammonia for their refrigeration. And then chlorine, we have a few chlorine facilities. Clorox is right around the corner from our office. But chlorine is primarily used in our wastewater treatment plants. So that's primarily where we're looking at chlorine. And that's all I have for our program. If you have any questions, again, my name is Sean Taylor and my contact information is here. Thank you very much.